Please, don't remove my clothes, the Comanche girl begged. But the cowboy did, and it broke him. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The winter of 1882 had been colder than most across Llano country. The land was flat and open, scattered with live oak and low draws where water pooled from the last storms. At dusk, sleet came in sharp needles, driven sideways by the north wind. Cole Merrick rode the fence line, his scarf drawn high and hat pulled low. He had been out since first light, repairing breaks in the wire, checking posts leaned too far with age, and marking where cattle might wander if not patched. Work like this filled the days, steady, unending, and safe from the pull of memory. Cole was 38, rangy and quiet. He had once driven long cattle trails north, but left that life behind after his wife and infant son died of fever 3 winters back. The talk in town, the pitying looks, had been worse than the silence of an empty cabin. He had moved farther out, taken line work, and kept his head down. Now his life was fences, feed, and long rides with only his mare for company, as the light dimmed. He guided the horse toward a flooded draw. Water shone dark between the reeds. That was when he spotted a figure slumped against the bank, half hidden by brush stiff with ice. His hand went to the rifle first. Habit, but then he saw the truth. A woman that he dismounted fast, boots sinking into mud that sucked at his heels. She was young, maybe mid-20s, dressed in deerskin that was torn and soaked through. The fringe clung to her legs, and her ribs were dark with blood from a bullet graze. Her skin was bronze-toned, her hair long and black, a braid fallen loose at the end. Kneeling, Cole set his hand near her throat and felt the faint pulse. Alive. Her eyelids flickered, and suddenly her eyes opened, sharp, dark, and filled with fear. She gasped and clutched the front of her dress tight, whispering in broken English through chattering teeth, "Please, don't remove my clothes." For a moment, Cole just looked at her. He felt her fear like a weight. He remembered his wife's hand pulling a blanket tight in her fever, the helplessness of not being able to stop what was coming. He set his jaw. "I won't," he said plainly, voice low. "Just what's needed to stop the bleeding." He shrugged off his coat and placed it gently over her. She stared at him hard, as if waiting for a trick, then gave the smallest nod. Only then did he slide his knife from his sheath. He cut away the ruined seam, never more than the damaged cloth demanded, eyes on the work and not her body. He tore strips from his own shirt, bound the wound snug, and pulled the wool blanket from his saddle roll to wrap around her. Her body sagged against him. She was half conscious again, skin hot despite the cold. He lifted her carefully into his arms, mounted up with her across his chest, and turned the horse toward the line cabin. The cabin stood 2 miles off under a clutch of oaks, one room only, but with a stove and shelter from the wind. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, carried her inside, and laid her on the rope bed against the wall. She stirred, groaning, and he spoke softly. "You're safe here. I'll fix the fire." The cabin smelled of cold ash and raw wood. He knelt by the stove, stacked kindling, and coaxed the flame until heat spread. He set a pot on to melt snow, then laid out a kettle and strips of cloth to boil. All the while he kept his hat on, his body turned slightly away. When he checked the bandage again, she fought to keep her eyes open. "More clean cloth," he said, holding one strip up so she could see. "Ready." Her jaw tightened, but she nodded once. He cleaned and rewrapped the wound slow, careful with his hands. When he offered laudanum, she shook her head hard. He didn't press. Through the night, the storm rattled the chinking, sleet slapping against the roof. Cole sat in a chair, angled toward the door. Rifle leaned close, the fire crackling behind him. He checked her fever each hour, spooned water to her lips when she whispered for it, and covered her again when she shifted in pain. She studied his hands more than his face, the slow knots, the way he set tools straight on the table, the care in each movement. It was steadiness she could measure, and steadiness was what she needed. Cole's thoughts were a grindstone turning. He knew nothing of who she was, only that she was Comanche, wounded, and afraid. Helping her could bring trouble. Men often came hunting when they thought a woman had slipped their grip. But leaving her had never been an option. He told himself he was just keeping her alive until morning, until she was strong enough to choose her way. Still, as the hours dragged on and the wind shook the walls, he stayed near. Watching over her like the act itself meant something more. By dawn, the fever eased, her breathing steadier. She woke to the sound of his knife on kindling and the smell of cornmeal mush cooking. He kept his back turned, raising his coat as a screen so she could adjust the blanket without shame. He didn't look until she called quiet for water. She studied him across the cabin then, eyes searching. "Ayoka," she said, naming herself with a voice still rough. "Cole Merrick," he answered simply. Nothing more. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the beginning of a strange, fragile truce. Two people, stranded in winter, waiting to see if the cabin could hold more than one. The cabin was still wrapped in the gray light of early morning when Cole set the bowls of cornmeal mush on the table. The stove gave a low roar, pushing heat against the icy windows. Ayoka sat on the edge of the bed, still pale, her blanket drawn close around her shoulders. Her eyes followed every move he made, not out of fear now, but because she was measuring him, waiting to see what sort of man had taken her in. Cole pulled the chair out for her without a word. She hesitated, then stood slowly, her legs shaky. He reached forward on instinct to steady her, but stopped short, hands hovering just near her arms. She looked at him once, then allowed his grip at her forearms. Her skin felt too hot, but her stance held firm after breath. He let go as soon as she found her balance, stepping back with a half nod. They ate without hurry. He noticed how careful she was, lifting the spoon as if she hadn't eaten in days. He knew the question the silence carried. Why was she here, alone, with a bullet wound? He asked none of it. Still, his mind kept turning. He'd seen sign along the ridge the past week. 3 riders, not from around here. If they were the ones who left her bleeding, they might circle back. After breakfast, he busied himself with chores. The water bucket was low, so he pulled on his coat and stepped outside, filling it with snow to melt. His mind worked in a steady rhythm of tasks. Keep her alive, keep trouble off, don't crowd her. Inside, she had pulled his coat across the room and held it up like a curtain while she straightened her torn dress beneath. When he returned, he pretended not to notice, setting the bucket on the stove and stirring the pot with the back of his knife. Ayoka's voice broke the quiet. "Why you live here?" Her words were careful, accented, but steady. He hesitated before answering. "Fence work. Cattle outfit pays me to ride line. Cabin's part of the deal." He didn't mention the grave on the hill he'd left behind in town, or how silence was easier than listening to pity. She nodded, as if the short answer told her enough. Her eyes dropped back to her lap, fingers tightening around the torn seam of her dress. After a long pause, she spoke again. "Men shot me, wanted to take me. I ran." Her gaze lifted to meet his, flat and unflinching. "They come again." Cole felt the words like a weight pressing down. He didn't show it, only gave a slow nod. "I saw tracks yesterday. 3 riders." He moved to the table, checked the Winchester, and began oiling the bolt. His jaw tightened, not at her, but the thought of men who hunted a woman down like stock. The questions listeners might have hung in the air. Why her? Why alone? Where was her family? Cole didn't press, but she answered in pieces. "Soldiers push my people north. Some taken east. I stay behind. Family gone." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she did not look away. He respected that she told only what she chose. He didn't ask more. Instead, he showed her the small trapdoor under the bed, the crawl space barely tall enough to lie flat. "If they ride here, you can wait below." Her head shook hard. Not hide, not alone. He studied her a moment, then nodded once. No argument. Together, then, that day passed in the rhythm of small labors. He split wood and stacked it by the stove. She swept cinders with a straw broom he had cut months back. He stepped out when she bathed behind a blanket strung on a rope, coming back to find his coat folded square on the chair. She sewed the torn seam of her dress with rawhide thong from her pouch, each stitch tight and careful, reclaiming dignity piece by piece. By sundown, a new tension settled. Horse sign again on the ridge, faint but certain. Cole closed the shutter, laid the rifle across his knees, and set an extra blanket over the window. He did not announce fear, but his movements told the truth. Ayoka noticed. She took the fire poker in her hands and sat near the stove, eyes on the latch. When her hands trembled, he slid a tin cup of water across the floor so she could drink without turning away. That simple act steadied her more than words might have. They sat like that for hours, two strangers tied together by a silent standoff, waiting on the men outside who had not yet shown themselves. The silence wasn't empty now. It carried weight, almost like an agreement. He would not leave her. She would not give up her ground, by the time the fire burned low and the cabin filled with shadows. Cole knew their fight was only beginning. But he also knew she wasn't just a burden he'd taken in. She was someone who refused to break, and that made him want to stand firmer than before. The cabin held its breath that night. The only sound the low crackle of wood and the faint hiss of wind slipping through the chinking. Cole sat at the table with the Winchester across his knees, his eyes fixed on the door more than the fire. Ayoka sat close to the stove with the poker in her hand, her braid coiled once around her wrist like she had to anchor herself. Both of them listened for the same thing, the scrape of hooves, the shift of men outside who hadn't yet made themselves known. Near midnight, the sound came. A horse snorted beyond the tree line, followed by the faint creak of saddle leather. Cole felt his gut tighten. He had been expecting it since sundown, but expectation never dulled the first sound of danger. He raised a finger, sharp and silent, telling her not to move. Her eyes flicked to him, then to the door, and she steadied her grip on the iron poker. The latch rattled once. Then again, someone outside testing it. Cole rose slowly, keeping his weight balanced, and called through the door, voice flat and unshaken. "This place is mine. You try that again, you'll lose your hand." Silence followed, long enough to wonder if they had gone. Then the sound of low laughter, 3 men at least, voices muffled but carrying a tone she recognized. Her chest rose hard against the blanket as she whispered, "Them." Cole moved to the window, lifted a corner of the blanket he'd hung, and saw shadows against the snow. They weren't leaving. He didn't fire into them. Not yet. A warning had to be clear, not wasteful. He stepped back, worked the lever on the Winchester, and aimed high through the crack in the shutter. The shot split the night, echoing off the oaks. He had aimed above their hats on purpose. The horses spooked, the men cursed, and then the sound of hooves pounded back into the trees, but they weren't gone. He knew their kind. Men like that circled. They would wait for a weak hour, a slip of guard. The hours after were the hardest. Not fighting, not moving, just waiting. He kept the rifle across his knees, head tilted, so he could hear past the fire's pop. Ayoka sat stiff on the chair, poker still in her hand, eyes locked on the door. When her hands began to tremble from strain, Cole slid a tin cup along the floor until it touched her knee. She didn't look at him, didn't need to. She drank, set it down, and her grip steadied again, eye in that silence. Questions from the first chapter hung heavy, and they pressed to the surface now. Why had the men shot her? Why did they chase her across frozen country? Cole asked plain, his voice no louder than it needed to be. Why are they after you? Her answer came steady, without apology. They want to trade me. I fought. I ran. Her gaze locked on the latch. Men don't forget when a woman runs. It was the kind of answer that told more than she spoke. Cole's jaw set hard. He didn't ask further. He had lived long enough to know the shape of cruelty didn't need more detail. What mattered was the now, the men outside, the woman inside, and his choice to keep her alive. By the time dawn edged gray through the cracks, the riders were gone. Cole eased the shutter back and scanned the ridge. Empty. Snow showed their tracks leading off east. He let out a breath he had held all night. When he turned, Ayoka was watching him, her eyes dark but steady. She reached for his wrist. Only a brief touch, but it carried more weight than words. He didn't pull away. His hand shifted, covering hers, rough palm over her smaller fingers. No speech, no promise. Just the simple truth of being there. Later that morning, he cleaned the wound again. He showed her the cloth first. waiting for her nod before he touched her. She didn't flinch this time. He noticed the way her shoulders dropped, just slightly, as if trust was building by degrees. Afterward, when she rose to her feet and balanced without help, she surprised him, leaning forward and pressing her lips to his once, quick and certain. He froze, then returned the kiss carefully, as if he feared breaking something fragile. For Cole, it wasn't heat or claim. It was recognition. That in the long night of fear, she had chosen to stand beside him, and he had chosen the same that BY afternoon. Routine returned. He split wood in the yard, eyes scanning the ridge between swings. She sewed by the window, needle flashing through leather, repairing what had been torn. The questions from Chapter 1 that might have lingered, whether she had family, whether he would send her away, found their first answers in her words that night. When he mentioned riding her north to where her people had been driven, she shook her head. No one left. Only me. That truth hit heavier than the rifle on his knees. He didn't say anything more. He only pulled the chair nearer to the stove and set her repaired dress across it to dry. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was the beginning of something shared, built on fear survived and choices made side by side. The snow outside had settled into a thin, hard crust by morning, glittering faintly under a pale sun. Cole stepped out to check the tracks that cut across the ridge. The riders had pulled east, but the prince told him what he already knew. They hadn't gone far, just moved out of sight. Men like that never quit easy, especially not when they thought they had unfinished business. He rubbed a stiff hand down the mare's neck, mind already mapping the ground between here and the tree line, deciding where they might return from and what he could do about it. Inside, Ayoka sat by the stove, her braid loose over her shoulder as she finished stitching the seam of her dress. She glanced up when he returned, her eyes sharper than the night before. She had questions too, the ones left hanging after he bound her wound and shared her silence. She asked him not to pry, but to know what kind of man she was tied to now. You fight before? Cole leaned the rifle against the wall, shaking snow off his coat. Plenty. Trail work, cattle towns. Never wanted to, but it finds you. He hesitated, then added, lost my family 3 years back. Fever. After that, I stopped looking for trouble. Just keep fence, keep to myself. It wasn't a confession he gave lightly, but she had told him enough of her own past for him to match it. She nodded slowly, as though that explained his silence, his careful way of moving around her. You keep me alive last night, she said, her voice flat but weighted with intent. Not for yourself. Why? He studied her, the way she gripped the fabric of her dress like it was more than cloth, like it was the last piece of her dignity. He didn't offer any noble speech, because it was right, because no one else would. It was all the truth he had. The day passed with purpose. Cole worked outside to strengthen what little defense the cabin could hold. He moved the water bucket inside, stacked wood high by the stove, and tested every hinge and latch. He showed her how to brace the chair under the door handle, a trick he'd learned in rough towns. Ayoka didn't just watch. She asked questions about the rifle, about how many bullets, about what she could do if he fell. He answered without condescension, handing her the lever action to feel its weight. She held it awkwardly, but her eyes stayed hard. The listeners who might wonder why she didn't just leave, why she stayed in the cabin with a stranger, found their answer in the evening quiet. She had nowhere left to run. North was gone. East meant soldiers. West meant men who hunted her. The cabin wasn't just shelter. It was the first place someone had asked her permission before touching her. That mattered more than the risk. That night, as dusk pulled the cold close again, Cole lit only a single lantern and kept the stove low. They'll try after dark, he said. That's when men think a body gets tired. He sat with the rifle across his lap. She set herself beside the stove with the poker, posture straight. Hours dragged. The silence pressed heavy, but it wasn't empty. Every small sound, the snap of the fire, the creak of the roof, pulled their eyes to the door. When her breathing quickened, he spoke low, steady. They'll come if they're fools. We'll be ready if they are. Sometime past midnight, the crunch of hooves broke the stillness. Shadows moved against the pale snow. Cole felt the old knot of fear coil in his gut, but he kept his hands steady, thumbing the checkering on the rifle stock. He nodded once toward her, not a command, but an acknowledgement. They were in it together. The latch shifted. A voice outside called low, taunting, "Hand her over, Cowboy, and we'll be on our way." Ayoka's jaw locked tight. She gripped the poker so hard her knuckles whitened. Cole's chest burned with the urge to answer in kind, but he didn't shout, didn't waste air. He chambered a round slow, the metallic click carrying through the wood. His answer was calm, unshaken. Not happening. The silence that followed was long. Then boots shuffled, and one of the men pressed a hand against the door. Cole raised the rifle, aimed for the space just above where he imagined their heads, and fired. The shot cracked the night, splintering the top board of the doorframe. The men cursed, horses screamed, and they scattered into the dark again. Cole lowered the rifle, but didn't ease. He knew this wasn't finished. They would weigh their pride against their fear and decide whether to return. For now, though, the cabin still stood, and so did the two of them. Ayoka exhaled hard, her shoulders shaking once before she steadied herself again. She looked at him, not with gratitude, but with the firm recognition of someone who understood what it meant to fight side by side. For the first time, she said it clear. Together. Cole gave a short nod, the only answer needed. Morning came without a shot fired. The riders had pulled back into the trees before dawn, but Cole knew better than to believe they were finished. He stepped outside at first light, rifle slung, scanning the snow where their prints looped and crisscrossed like men who hadn't decided whether to strike or slink off. He counted 3 sets of tracks again, the same as before. Patient men, waiting for hunger or fear to open the cabin door. Inside, Ayoka was at the stove, crouched low, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush with the handle of a wooden spoon. The sight made him pause. She had her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, hair braided tight again, face drawn but steadier than the night he found her. She had claimed part of the cabin, claimed the task of cooking, and in that small act was the answer to a question any listener might have carried since the beginning. Why didn't she just run? The truth was plain. There was nowhere safer than this small room with its single stove and a man who asked before he touched. Cole hung his coat, set the rifle within reach, and sat opposite her at the table. "They'll be back," he said simply. She didn't flinch. "Then we wait." They ate in silence, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people listening to the same thread outside, the same creak of trees, the same warning in the wind. The day passed in work they shared without fuss. Cole split wood in the yard, each strike ringing sharp across the frozen air, while Ayoka swept the cabin floor and shook the bedding outside. When he returned, she had mended one of his shirts with the spare cloth Mrs. Talbot had once brought him, her stitches uneven but strong. She handed it over folded, not looking at him, as she said, "You gave your shirt for bandage. Now it is whole again." He took it with a nod, surprised at how the simple act caught in his chest. He had been used to mending alone, eating alone, talking to no one for months. Having another pair of hands in the cabin shifted the weight of silence into something different, something that made the place feel less like a bunkhouse and more like a home. By late afternoon, he set a plan. "We'll take turns through the night. One rests, one watches. They won't risk a charge unless they think we're sleeping." She agreed without hesitation, setting her jaw like a soldier given orders. When her turn came, she sat with the rifle across her lap, shoulders squared despite the fresh scar beneath her dress. He lay on a rope bed, boots still on, hat tilted over his face. Sleep came light, broken, but he allowed himself the trust to close his eyes because she was there keeping watch. When he woke near midnight, she was still sitting stiff in the chair, the rifle steady across her knees, though her eyes were heavy. He rose, walked over, and touched her hand briefly. "My turn." She didn't argue, only handed the rifle across, her fingers brushing his longer than needed. That touch lingered even after she lay down on the bed and turned her face to the wall. The questions left from earlier chapters found their answers in those small hours. How could two strangers, a Comanche woman and a reclusive cowboy, trust each other enough to share guard in the dead of night? The answer wasn't spoken. It was in the fact that she slept while he watched, and he slept while she guarded, and neither of them doubted the other would hold the line. That'd be why Donna riders were still out there. Cole saw smoke faint on the ridge, proof they had camped rather than moved on. Trouble hadn't passed, only paused. He closed the shutter again and set the rifle back on the table. Ayoka rose from the bed, hair loose now, her dress patched but still rough at the seams. She caught his eye as she spoke, voice hoarse but certain. I stay here. I don't run. If they come, I fight. He studied her a long moment, then gave a single nod. Not because he agreed with the risk, but because he knew she would accept nothing else. And in that nod was an unspoken truth that any listener might have wondered since Chapter 1, whether Cole saw her as a burden or as someone worth standing beside. The answer was plain in the way he loaded each cartridge into the Winchester one by one, steady and sure. They were not just surviving side by side anymore. They were preparing as if the cabin belonged to both of them. The sixth day broke colder than the rest, the kind of cold that burned the lungs with every breath. Cole stepped out into the yard, boots crunching on the hard crust of snow, and saw the smoke again on the ridge. The men hadn't left. They were waiting, circling, maybe deciding how much the woman inside was worth to them. He felt the weight of it sit in his chest. He had seen sieges before, usually in towns, drunk men surrounding a saloon. Out here it was different. No law, no sheriff. Just him, her, and the thin boards of cabin. When he came back inside, Ayoka was feeding the fire with small pieces of split wood. She looked at him sharply, searching his face for answers he didn't speak. He gave them anyway. They're still there. She nodded once, without surprise. They want me. Her voice was steady, not as a victim, but as someone who refused to be carried like property again. Cole sat at the table, laying out ammunition in a row. His hands moved slow, deliberate. They try harder tonight. That day, they worked as if the cabin was a fort. Cole dragged extra logs against the wall, facing the ridge, more for peace of mind than real cover. Ayoka boiled strips of cloth, not only for wounds but for smoke masks if the men tried fire. The questions a listener might have asked since the beginning, could she defend herself, or was she only relying on him, were answered here. She practiced with a rifle, awkward at first, then better. Her shoulder braced, her cheek pressed to the stock, her breath steady. Cole corrected her grip once, his hand closing lightly over hers, and the moment carried a weight beyond the lesson. She looked at him and didn't pull away until he stepped back. Evening fell, and with it came the test. A horse snorted close in the trees, then another. Cole set himself by the door, rifle ready, while Ayoka crouched by the shutter with the pistol he'd handed her. The men didn't knock this time. They shouted, "Cowboy, you hand her out, and maybe we let you walk." Cole's reply was calm, even. "You want her, you'll have to take her through me." The first blow came at the door, a boot slamming hard. The frame rattled. Cole fired through the top plank, splinters flying, and the men staggered back, cursing. A pause, then the sound of glass shattering. A bottle with flame, lobbed against the outside wall. Smoke hissed, but the snow smothered most of it before it caught. Still, the intent was cleared. Ayoka's breath quickened, but she didn't freeze. She gripped the pistol tight, eyes locked on the window. Cole glanced at her, saw the fear under the surface, and spoke low. "You're safe. I'm here." That reassurance wasn't for show. It was for her, and it steadied her enough to hold her ground. When another shadow darted near the shutter, she fired once, the shot cracking sharp into the dark. A cry answered back, proof she hadn't missed by much. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't drop the weapon. The fight stretched into long minutes, then hours. Men circling, testing, throwing threats against the walls. Cole answered only when needed, one round at a time, never wasting. The fire inside burned low, and the cabin smelled of gunpowder and smoke, but still stood. When dawn finally broke, the ridge was quiet. The tracks told the truth. Two of the men had dragged a wounded one away. For now, the siege was broken. Inside, Cole set the rifle aside, his body sagging from hours of tension. Ayoka lowered the pistol, her hands trembling only once the danger had passed. She looked at him, chest heaving. and her eyes carried something unspoken. Gratitude, yes, but more than that. She had stood with him, not behind him. She crossed the room slow, placed her hand against his chest, and whispered, "Together." He laid his hand over hers, rough palm pressing warmth into her fingers. In that moment, the cabin felt different. Not just a shelter, not just his. The question that had lingered since the first night, whether she would leave when she was strong enough, hung silent between them. Her touch gave the answer without words. That night, when they lay down, it wasn't just for sleep. He stayed near, boots still on, rifle within reach, but her shoulder brushed his, and neither of them moved away. Trust had been carved in the dark hours of the siege, and now it held. The morning after the attack was sharp with frost. Smoke from the stove trailed thin through the chimney. A signal Cole didn't like leaving for eyes on the ridge, but the cabin needed heat. He stepped outside, scanning the line of trees with his rifle over his arm. The snow told the story clear. 3 riders had pulled back, dragging a fourth between them. One of them had been hit bad, likely the man Ioka had fired on. That explained why they hadn't pressed harder before dawn. But Cole knew men like that didn't forgive. They'd be back if pride outweighed fear. Inside, Ioka was crouched at the hearth, adding wood. Her face was drawn with fatigue, but her eyes tracked him the second he came in. She asked nothing, just read his look. He answered anyway. They're not gone for good, but one's hurt. She didn't relax, only set the pot back over the flames. Hurt men make crueler choices, she said quietly. He knew she was right. They sat down to eat, cornmeal again, with strips of jerky softened in broth. The routine was plain, but it steadied them both. For the first time since she had woken in his cabin, she asked him about his life before. Why you stay alone? Not with kin. It was a question a listener would have carried since the first chapter, unspoken until now. Cole set down his spoon, eyes on the table. Had a wife. Had a boy. Fever took them. Couldn't stand town after. Out here, work keeps the mind straight. His voice was flat, but his hands tightened around the tin bowl. Ioka studied him in silence, then spoke low. I kin. Soldiers scattered them. Some gone north, some east. Maybe dead. I don't know. Only this dress left from my mother. She touched the repaired seam, her fingers steady now instead of clutching. That detail answered the other question a listener might have wondered. Why she had fought so hard for the torn garment when Cole first found her. It wasn't vanity. It was the last piece of family she carried. The rest of the day was spent repairing what the night had shaken. Cole checked the doorframe splintered by boots, reinforced it with new nails and a plank from the shed. Ioka cut cloth into strips, rolling them tight for bandages. They worked without waste. Every act a step toward lasting another night, WY dusk. Cole made a choice. We can't wait for them to decide. If they press again, it'll be harder. He hesitated, then added, but I won't leave you. We hold here. Ioka met his eyes, unblinking. I choose this place too. Not running. That night, they shared guard again, but something had shifted. When Cole handed her the rifle for her turn, her fingers brushed his, and neither pulled away. Later, when he dozed in the chair, he woke to find her seated close by, her blanket draped across both their shoulders. She didn't speak, only stayed near, and he didn't shift away. The bond between them, fragile at first, had grown into something visible now. The questions from earlier, whether she trusted him, whether he saw her as a burden, were answered in those wordless hours. They were not strangers thrown together by chance anymore. They were two people who had decided, in their own ways, to stand side by side. Before dawn, the land outside was still and silent, the riders not yet returned. But the danger had carved something permanent inside the cabin. When Ioka laid her hand lightly against his arm as the fire cracked low, Cole didn't move to hide the feeling that rose in him. He covered her hand with his own, steady and sure. For the first time since the fever years, he let himself think not just of surviving the next day, but of having someone to survive it with. The 8th night came heavy with silence. The snow had stopped 2 days ago, leaving the land bare and brittle under a hard sky. Cole knew the quiet didn't mean safety. It meant men were planning. He kept the rifle across his lap, the fire low, and the lamp turned down so the cabin looked darker from outside. Ayoka sat opposite, her blanket drawn close, but her posture was straight. She had asked earlier what would happen if the riders got through the door. It was the kind of question any listener might have carried since the first gunshot. Cole had answered plain, without flinching. Then I stand in their way. And if I fall, you take the rifle and make sure none of them walk out. She had looked at him long, then nodded. Not because she wanted the burden, but because she understood there was no other truth. Near midnight, the attack came. Hooves hammered through the stillness, closer this time, reckless with desperation. The door shuddered under the slam of a shoulder. Cole was already in place, lever cocked, eyes steady. He fired once through the top board, with splintering. A cry tore out from outside. Another boot hit harder, and Ayoka braced the chair under the latch. Move back, Cole ordered, stepping forward. He shoved the table against the door just as it buckled under another hit. Shadows shifted at the shutter, this time a pistol barrel flashing between the cracks. The shot missed high, tearing a hole in the wall. Cole answered with his own round, and silence followed. The men pulled back for only a moment before circling again. This time, one of them tried the roof. Cole heard boots scrape shingles, the sound sharp over the wind. He shoved a rifle into Ayoka's hands. Hold the door. Don't let them through. She gripped it, her face set, as he grabbed the pistol and moved to the rafters. The figure dropped halfway through before Cole fired. The man fell with a thud into the snow. His horse, spooking Wild Point 2, remained. Their shouts were angry now, slurred with fear, but they didn't quit. They circled wide, firing into the walls to rattle the cabin. Ayoka answered once, her shot snapping through the shutter, close enough to make one of them curse and pull back. She had learned quickly. Cole saw it in the way she reloaded with shaking but steady hands. The standoff stretched until the faint gray of dawn crept across the cracks. Finally, the riders broke. One led the other, dragging their wounded comrade. The sound of hooves faded east. Cole stayed at the door until silence was certain. Only then did he lower the rifle. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and powder. The table was scarred, the wall pocked with holes, but they still stood. Ayoka leaned against the bedpost, the rifle loose in her hands. When he looked at her, she managed a breathless, "We live." He crossed the room, took the weapon from her, and set it down. His hand lingered over hers, rough palm over her trembling fingers. "Because you stood with me." For a moment, neither moved. Then she reached up, her other hand brushing the line of his jaw. The closeness wasn't rushed, wasn't forced. She leaned in, pressing her lips to his, slow and certain. This wasn't the quick kiss of gratitude she had given after the first siege. This was a choice, clear and deliberate. Cole answered with the same restraint he showed in everything else. Firm, steady, a man careful not to take more than was given. When they parted, the silence between them felt changed. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was belonging. The questions left hanging since the first chapters, whether she would leave when she was healed, whether he was strong enough to open himself again, had their answer here. She had chosen not to run. He had chosen not to let go. That morning, Cole fixed the door with new boards, his hands steady despite the exhaustion. Ayoka cooked the last of the cornmeal, setting the bowls on the table without a word. When he sat across from her, their shoulders nearly touched, and neither shifted away. Outside, the land lay still, the danger pushed back for now. Inside, the cabin no longer felt like his alone. It felt like theirs. The land was quiet for the first time in a week. Cole rode out at dawn, his breath hanging in the frozen air, scanning the ridges one last time. The snow told him everything. 3 sets of tracks pulling east, no fresh sign of return. The men were gone for good, pride broken by fear and blood loss. He followed their trail far enough to be certain, then turned back toward the cabin. The tension that had pressed on his chest for days eased with every hoofbeat homeward. When he pushed the cabin door open, the smell of bread greeted him. Ayoka was at the stove, sleeves rolled, her braid falling over her shoulder as she pulled a pan of corn cakes from the heat. She looked up, searching his face. Gone, gone, he said simply, leaning the rifle against the wall. For the first time, he meant it without reservation. Relief showed in her posture, though she didn't smile. Instead, she nodded once and set the bread on the table. They ate together, the silence no longer tight with fear. It carried a weight of decision instead. After the meal, Cole stepped outside to chop wood. The question any listener might have carried since the beginning pressed on him now. What would happen when she healed? Would she ride away north, or walk east, or leave him back to his quiet? He drove the axe into the block again and again, thinking of the empty years since fever had taken his family, of the way the cabin had stood like a tomb until she filled it with fire and movement. Inside, Ayoka cleaned the cabin, folding blankets, mending torn shirts, setting her pouch of beads on the shelf he had cleared for her. Each act was small, but it answered the question as clearly as words. She was not preparing to leave. She was claiming the space, WY afternoon. He found her outside, watching the horizon with the coat he had given her pulled tight. He joined her, standing silent for a long while before he spoke. I said I'd ride you where you wanted. Kin, friends, anywhere. Her eyes stayed on the horizon. No one left. No place waiting. Only here. She turned then, steady. You gave me choice. I choose this. Cole felt something shift inside him, something he had buried since the graves of his wife and boy. He nodded once, a man's wordless promise. Then here it is. The days after were no longer survival, but routine, built with both their hands. He split cedar and planed it into a box for her beadwork. She swept and cooked, hanging dried herbs by the stove. When he went out to ride fence, she was there mending seams or hauling water. The cabin no longer a solitary place, but a shared one. Mrs. Talbot visited once, her eyes sharp as she handed over cloth and salve. She took in the sight of Ayoka tending the fire and Cole stacking wood without speaking, then gave a small, knowing nod. Good to see life in this place again. It was the outside witness neither of them had asked for, but both needed. One evening, when the sun stretched gold across the floorboards, Cole sat carving the cedar box. Ayoka sat beside him, sewing a tear in his coat. Their hands brushed on the table, not deliberate, not withdrawn. She looked at him once, then leaned in, pressing her lips to his again, slower this time, certain. He returned it without hesitation. This kiss was not about danger past. It was about staying. The final image was simple but whole. The cabin warmed by the stove, 2 sets of boots by the door, her beadwork tucked into the cedar box he had made. Cole's grief, no longer the only presence in the room. Ayoka's dress repaired, her dignity intact, her choice made. Their hands resting near each other, not needing to hold, because the decision had already been made. They would not part. The cabin was theirs. The long winter had given them something neither expected. Family rebuilt not by blood but by choice. And when the wind rattled the chinking, they didn't tense anymore. They stayed, together.